All right, welcome to Talking Capitalism. Today we are talking with Dr. Sharri Plonski. Sharri is a senior lecturer in international politics at Queen Mary University of London in East London, and she's got a wide range of awesome research touching on like citizenship, to settler colonialism, to transportation infrastructure, to Palestine and Israel. I'm going to let Sharri introduce herself, and maybe Sharri, you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself. Maybe if you have connections to Turtle Island, might be interesting for the students, and how you come to understand this thing we call capitalism.
Hi, everyone. This is awkward, but very nice to meet you all in this awkward way. So as you can tell by my accent, I'm not from London. I have lots of these kind of colonial and post-colonial roots that have pushed me all around the world. Was born in Canada, but my family is it's originally from Israel, but obviously originally not from Israel, originally from Poland. We were part of those migrant settler communities that came and colonized Palestine in the early 20th century. And so I sit as multiple, I guess, as a multiple subject of settler, colonizer, migrant and arrivant or colonizer in Canada, and then as a child of immigrants, and then now in the UK, and who knows what I am here. In terms of, which is also, I guess, part of where my research comes out of. My research is about those kinds of ideas of a moving settler colonialism or a moving imperial infrastructure, and it gets really landed or territorialized in the context of Palestine and the practices of the Israeli state, looking explicitly at the moment through the types of materials that make settler colonialism possible, and under that, the materials that make racial capitalism possible, and kind of looking at these deeper embedded roots of the contemporary colonial project in Palestine as having this really longer history that is situated in global movements of capitalism and colonialism. I hope that explains a bit about who I am.
Thanks for that, Sharri. So, maybe this is a great time to move on to the reading selections that you gave us. So the readings that you shared with us, I find paints a really vivid picture of racism and capitalism and that racial capitalism that you just mentioned. And I was also struck at how, in what you've shared with us, it shows how at times ahistorical the kind of settler colonial capitalist gaze has been in kind of misunderstanding, in particular, indigenous practices and integrating it into a settler colonial way of seeing the world. I was wondering if you could comment on some of that and maybe share with us why the texts that you shared with us are so important to you.
So I should have also said a bit more about where I feel about understanding capitalism and this amazing project that you're doing with your students, which is to kind of really ground them in both the historical, but also the kind of intellectual journey people have taken to understand what capitalism is, how it operates, and how deeply it is embedded in the imperial project. Without imperialism, there wouldn't be colonialism. Without imperialism, there wouldn't be capitalism. Without capitalism, there wouldn't be imperialism. And the colonial project that you all live in Canada is very much dependent on that kind of entangled journey. And of course, we talk about it a lot as racial capitalism at the moment, because we're understanding more and more how race is a deep interlocutor of capitalism and how capitalism makes race work. But all of those things are entangled with each other. And the reason I guess I chose these readings is that they were two key texts in helping me think through what that means, and think through okay, what are the key things that happen, and not just how these things kind of operate in the abstract, but how they took place when they actually arrived in a place and changed that entire landscape, changed all the relationships that were happening in that place prior to the arrival of these colonial settlers and huge imperial projects. So both those texts for me do a few things almost in conversation with each other, even though they weren't written with each other. But I often feel like Nick Estes, who wrote, and I brought some props.
All right.
The Future. and then Manu Karaka, who wrote this gorgeous book, Empire's Tracks. First of all, they're both talking about infrastructure, right? As this kind of thing that gets embedded in place, that almost, but like both of them also talking about the way infrastructure that kind of was developed and put in place by, I guess, imperial governance or imperial actors could not have kind of done that work of making infrastructure without being tied to corporations, without being tied to huge amount of capital, because like it obviously costs so much money to make huge railway or pipeline infrastructures, that they were also like tied to certain types of both, you know, really like slave labor, but also unfree coolie labor, and that infrastructure ended up tying so many places across the world, even as it becomes really embedded in one place. So kind of what we start thinking as we read this stuff is that like something had to happen on the ground in a place. They couldn't have happened without all these bigger projects kind of funneled through them in a way. They were deeply tied to violence, because like to make infrastructure work, it had to like drive through particular land and communities. And they were really about change and movement. And that's also something that comes out in these two particular passages that I sent you, is that like that there's a set of relationships that are happening without infrastructure, without colonialism, without empire. That infrastructure was brought in to like directly disrupt those relationships and recast them in new ways that would make those relationships thereafter impossible. But also the reason I love these readings, and the final thing I'll say, is that like they help you think through like, what does relationship mean through the lens of Indigenous communities, through the lens of colonized communities all over the world, that was so antithetical. Like you said, there's this ahistorical kind of relationships that colonialism has with these people. It's all about like just not seeing the relationships that communities had to each other, to land, to life. And to me, like those capitalist projects came in to absolutely destroy that. And what we know of that means is death to those relationships, death to the way that land was lived, death to the buffalo herds, and the, you know, in order to clear that space and make room for kind of capitalist infrastructure.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's so, especially when we think about the ways that capitalism is normally narrated, right, as efficiency or just making things move faster. It's important, I think, to slow it down a bit and think about what the global consequences of that speed of these kind of material acquisitions are. I mean, you mentioned in the readings, they specifically, one of the texts talked about how missionaries misunderstood Indigenous ceremony and described it as prayer in a kind of Abrahamic sense. And it makes me think about like the hundreds of years between then and now that perhaps Indigenous ceremony has been reduced materially to a practice that is actually entirely alien to, maybe not entirely alien, but largely distinct from whatever it was that that folks were engaged with. Like, and that totally also has these global connotations to it. Yeah.
There's also this kind of way of looking at these relationships, whether they called it prayer, whether they called it mystical, or whether they called it like just some kind of other epistemology or ontology, that there was something about it that within, like, I guess, within kind of a colonial reading of these things, is that it was mythic, or that it was somehow disconnected from the earth or disconnected from reality, because of the way that, you know, they can't read it, they can't read it. But the thing about, like, let's say you have this one amazing line from Manu Karaka where he's like, actually what we need to understand is these relationships are concrete. They're actually like deeply concrete because they're tied to the land. And both texts kind of repeat that line of like, land is key to this, land is key to these relationships, not because land is important, but because life is important. Like this was, and this is the thing that is really like just not able to be grasped, that there is life in those relationships, or that you can have relationships to non-human things. And that is the whole point of this idea of like protecting the land, or it's actually about being in relationship with the land. And I thought it was also really interesting, that point about the prayer and about what it changed.
It really brings home, I think, the significance, or I think for history students to be thinking about how even the way that we're trained in the Western approach to history to understand land as being something that can be owned. Something as simple as that, the very idea of land ownership is actually very particular to a Eurocentric historical trajectory, and it does not have universal significance in different parts of the world, most specifically across what we today call, North America, quite problematically. But I would say probably in other parts of the world too, certainly anyway, but that's another issue. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, you're reminding me that I wanted like the students to kind of have a moment to think about that point about ownership, which also comes up in both these texts, that if you're in relationship to one another and in relationship to land and in relationship to water and in relationship to all like the non-human life, what comes home is this idea that you can't own it.
Yeah.
You can't own life. You can't own things that are alive. You can't, and that's the point both texts make about relationships. I'm using my hands a lot, hi students. But like this idea that those relationships, make it impossible to sell, own, alienate, and destroy. There's a different kind of care in those relationships. And to come back to this point, I guess, that you made about, I think, the way these things move a bit, this idea, or like that capitalism kind of prides itself on efficiency and things being smooth and flowing. And actually, like the kind of point that these texts make in particular, maybe because they're both looking at infrastructure, is that what capitalism does is absolutely the opposite. It produces containment, and it produces like blocks. In order to make some things move, other things have to be blocked. And I guess also what I love about both texts is that it then turns the lens on, like, from the lens of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous movements, that are like, these are the kinds of flows and relationships that these are working towards, and in kind of like almost like an anti-capitalist, not almost, sorry, it is very much an anti-capitalist set of movements, a demand for something else.
But that anti-capitalism, I think that the texts speak to the fact that it's anti-capitalist not for the sake of being anti-capitalist, but for the sake of defending life and creation in that sense, which is really, I think, quite so beautiful. It recasts the whole project in positive terms. We are not against the acquisition of material wealth. We are for the ability of life to thrive. And I think that's a really, it's a beautiful aspect of the text that you selected. So Sharri, we're coming up on time. Our class is comprised of mostly first-year students. These folks are going to be taking lots and lots of classes in the next 3 or 4 years, and they might not remember every single thing that we talk about in this class, though I hope that they will. In your opinion, what is one key takeaway if folks are going to forget everything else about capitalism? One key thing about capitalism that they need to remember for the rest of their lives, what would that be? Small question,
no problem. So for me, and particularly through the reading of these texts, actually, the idea of capitalism as alienation kind of really strikes home, that it is really about that, like, remapping of the world so that people are separate, so that they're not in relationship. And I think, which is why these kind of anti-capitalist projects are so powerful, because they're all about life and relationships, as you said. So I hope that that's what they take away from reading this material.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Plonski. We have been talking capitalism with Sharri Plonski, and we will tune in again next week.